Crystal Palace have been removed from the Europa League, but why? That's the question on my lips and everyone else's lips. This has been one of the most poorly reported legal sagas in football I can remember. Granted, I can't remember many, but it's been very infuriating as a Palace fan to read misconceptions about our argument and what we think has happened and why we've been wronged. So I'm going to run you through the whole thing right now. Just a warning, it is long, it is confusing, but it's important to know these things as a football fan. Do you like the little zoom in and out? Anyway, right, let's start off with the very simple question. Why have Crystal Palace been removed from the Europa League? Well, for that, we need to go to UEFA's rulebook. Basically, Palace have been in breach, allegedly, of their multi-club ownership rules, which are in itself a little bit unclear as to what they're actually referring to. Now, the top section 5.01a is irrelevant to Palace because Palace as a club are not involved with any other clubs in the Europa League. But C is important because of one individual, John Textor, who we'll hear more about very, very imminently, is involved in more than one club, or was involved in more than one club in Lyon. The key word here is control or influence or decisive influence within a club. So that can be majority of shareholders' voting rights, the right to remove or appoint a majority shareholder or someone from the board, or just being on the board or a shareholder or controlling a club in its entirety. Now, who in Palace was in breach of that? It was, of course, John Textor. Eagle Football Holdings, you can actually see on here that Palace is still included on their website. They owned Lyon, who you can see on there, and Palace. John Textor and Eagle Football Holding owned 43% of Palace, but they only had a 25% voting right despite being the biggest shareholder in terms of percentage within the club. Everyone knows that Steve Parish is Palace's main chairman. There are two other American stakeholders, Josh Harris and David Blitzer. They equally own 25% of the voting rights with John Textor, with Steve Parish having the golden vote if things can't be decided. Meaning, in reality, John Textor had less than 25% of voting right at Palace. Palace are no longer on there. John Textor has sold his shares in Palace. Now, the next question, people will go, well, why are you not allowed in and why are Lyon allowed in? That's just big club bias. Kind of is, but equally it does state in their rules that the club that has the higher league position takes priority over a team that had the lower league position. Palace, of course, got to Europe by winning the FA Cup, but we finished 12th. Lyon finished 6th in Ligue 1, which according to Lyon's rules, according to UEFA's rules, allows them to take precedent, which in itself is kind of stupid considering UEFA's own rules kind of dictate that the cup is more important than the league. Anyway, that's none of my business. So one question people have had is, why are Palace allowed to be in a multi-club ownership? Allegedly, we're not. We'll get onto that later. But someone like Girona and Man City and RB Leipzig and Salzburg are allowed to be in a multi-club ownership. And that comes down to legal loopholes, namely blind trusts. Now, the way that these clubs have got round the multi-club ownership rules is by technically not owning two clubs at the same time. How do you do that? You put your shares of one of the clubs into a blind trust. When your shares are in a blind trust, it means that you don't technically control the shares, someone else does, but you still own them. You can't buy more shares, you can't sell your shares, and you can't exercise any power over the company in which you have shares, but they are still technically yours. No one can see who is in control of the blind trust, but legally it is not the person who originally had them. So why didn't Crystal Palace put their shares in a blind trust? The answer is twofold to this. The first of them is that John Textor, who would have been the one who needed to put his shares in a blind trust, has been trying to sell his shares at Palace for a long time. This was in August of last year. He tried to buy Everton, to those of you who might remember. He has been looking to get rid of his stake in Palace for the best part of a year. Why? Because he doesn't have control over the club, which makes this whole thing even more stupid. There's a running joke in football that John Textor had the most expensive season ticket in the sport because while he owned 45% of Palace, he actually didn't have decisive control over us. Which brings me on to the second reason why we didn't put his shares in a blind trust. Palace didn't believe the multi-club ownership rules applied to them because Lyon and Palace are not in a multi-club ownership as such. We have never shared resource, we've never shared data, we've never shared staff. We've sold one player to Lyon who was an out-of-contract youngster, Jake O'Brien, who actually ironically plays for Everton now. That is the only transfer between the two teams in the history of the sport. So John Textor didn't put his shares in a blind trust because A, he wanted to sell his shares because he had no control, ironically, and B, Palace and Textor didn't believe the rule applied to them because of the lack of control that Textor had. So, to summarise so far, John Textor did not put his shares in Crystal Palace in a blind trust, aka ceding control of them, because he didn't think he was in charge of Palace and he wanted to sell his shares. He also owns Lyon, who, because they finished higher than Palace in their respective league, have taken precedent over Palace in the Europa League. Now, you might say, well, John Textor has sold his shares at Palace now, which everyone knows. Why does it matter? The deadline, for the first time ever, by the way, was the 1st of March 2025. For context, at that point, Crystal Palace were in the bottom half of the Premier League and hadn't even played Millwall yet in the FA Cup. Yet we were expected to somehow read the future and see that we were going to qualify for Europe, even though we didn't think the rule applied to us in the first place. It's very complicated. You get where I'm going with this. Now, amongst all of this, Nottingham Forest have become embroiled in the scandal. What have they got to do with it? Well, Nottingham Forest would take Palace's spot in the Europa League if the demotion is upheld. To add fuel to the fire in this situation, Nottingham Forest wrote to UEFA earlier this summer expressing concerns over Crystal Palace's place in the Europa League due to our multi-club ownership situation. Now, Forest fans will tell you that one Forest in the know said they were just seeking clarity on the rules. Put two and two together. Nottingham Forest wrote to UEFA when Palace were under investigation about the rules that Palace were under investigation about. It doesn't take a rocket scientist to work out Forest were trying to apply pressure here. In addition to this, Steve Parish went on The Rest Is Football with Gary Lineker and actually explicitly said that Nottingham Forest had influenced UEFA's decision. He said, we're led to believe that's the issue. If there wasn't somebody that was wanted to get in as a consequence, then there wouldn't be an issue. Now, Nottingham Forest fans will jump in now and say, oh, you think UEFA just did this because Nottingham Forest wrote to them? No, but we don't know how these things work. And if my chairman is coming out and saying that Forest had an influence, I'm obviously going to believe that, especially considering the fact they wrote to UEFA earlier in the summer about these exact rules. Steve Parish also said in the same interview that Tony Bloom, the Brighton chairman, could have done the same thing to help get Palace kicked out of the Conference League and get Brighton in there, but he chose not to, which is very interesting. UEFA is very political. This wouldn't surprise me at all. Now, you would have heard a lot, well, Palace broke the rules, so what's the issue? Why is everyone complaining? Well, did we break the rules? That is kind of the question that is on everyone's lips. Are these rules being broken by Palace's ownership situation? Unfortunately, these rules, when it comes to Palace, are not fit for purpose. Our ownership situation is very weird. John Textor owning 43% of the club, but only being in control of 25% of the voting rights is weird. It's a very unique situation. It speaks volumes as to what John Textor is like as an owner. How do you get yourself in that situation? I don't exactly know. But that is what's happened, and Palace, I think, rightly feel that they have not breached these rules. These rules are obviously open to interpretation, all right? Let me give you some examples right here. So, you might remember in April, I think it was, or maybe May actually, Evangelos Marinakis running on the pitch at the end of Nottingham Forest Leicester to talk to Nuno about the Awani injury. At this moment in time, Evangelos Marinakis had put his shares in a blind trust at Nottingham Forest. He was legally not in control of Forest when he ran on the pitch, but he ran on the pitch and berated the manager, underlining the fact that the blind trust issue is not a rule that Palace have broken. It's a loophole that Palace have not exploited. Some more examples right here. Alexander Seferin, the UEFA president, has said on a podcast, there are clubs where we pretend it's not the same owner, but it is the same owner. I will not tell you which, but you can guess. That is UEFA's own president saying that on a podcast. Now, who might he be referring to? My guess would probably be the RB clubs, who are actually allowed to compete in the same competition. RB Leipzig and Red Bull Salzburg are technically, according to UEFA's rules, not owned by the same person. There is a level of irony here as well, because the Conference League final, the competition Palace might be playing in, is being played at the Leipzig Stadium, who are not obviously owned by Red Bull. They're not. They're just called RB Leipzig, and they have the same owner and the same front and shirt sponsor, and they share the same name as Red Bull Salzburg. But they're not in a multi-club ownership. They're not. But Palace and Lyon obviously are. Do you see why these rules are flawed? So, just to briefly summarise again, I'm going to have to refer to my own notes because, as you can tell, it is very, very confusing. Palace have been kicked out of the Europa League because they have been deemed of breaching the multi-club ownership rules because of John Textor, who owned Crystal Palace and owned Lyon. He has since sold his shares in both clubs. Lyon take precedent over Palace because they finished higher in their respective league, even though Lyon would have lost their place to the French Cup winners had they had that worked out. It didn't. How come other clubs get away with it by putting their shares in a blind trust, which means you don't have control over those shares, but you still legally own them? Why didn't Crystal Palace do this? Because John Textor wanted to sell his shares, and you can't sell shares if they're in a blind trust. They also believed that Textor didn't have decisive influence over Palace, which is quoted as being a key part of multi-club ownership in UEFA's own rules. He has sold his shares now, so why is this still an issue? Because the deadline to sort your shares out was the 1st of March. Palace did not hit this deadline. What have Nottingham Forest got to do with this? Well, Forest will take Palace's spot in the Europa League if Palace's demotion gets upheld. They also wrote to UEFA to express concerns over Palace's place in the Europa League, thanks to their multi-club ownership situation. Have Palace broken any rules? That is down to your interpretation of the rules and Palace's ownership. It is very unclear. Even the most biased Nottingham Forest fan should be able to admit it's not exactly black and white. Did John Textor have decisive influence over Crystal Palace? I would say he didn't. John Textor himself would say he didn't. The rules maybe state otherwise. Marinakis ran on the pitch against Leicester when he didn't have decisive influence over Forest. He still was able to get on the pitch and talk to his manager. UEFA's own president has admitted on a podcast that they often pretend that clubs don't have the same owners when they actually do. Leipzig and Salzburg, for example, the RB clubs, are deemed as not having the same owners when they are literally called the same thing and sponsored by the same person and owned by the same people. So what is Palace's main argument to have this overturned? We have appealed the decision to the Court of Arbitration for Sport, and we will find out the result by the 11th of August. By the way, Palace's season starts the day before that, so this is kind of screwing up our plans for the year, if I'm going to be completely honest. The Athletic made a really good article about this. I'm not going to go through it, too granularly. Pay to read it, and you can read it. But it kind of touches on what I said earlier. What would we argue? The main thing is that John Textor didn't have decisive influence over Palace. The fact that he's put a lot of money into the club is the main argument against this. And whilst that is true, I would argue that makes you an investor and not a decision maker. He actually said that Steve Parish's son probably had as much influence over Palace as he did. The other argument, and I think the main one that I want to touch on that's not too loopholey, is sporting justice and fairness. Now, what actually happens if Palace and Lyon are in the same European competition next season? What is the risk to the competitive integrity if they are? Considering both clubs don't even have that owner anymore, he has left both of them. What is the issue? UEFA don't want clubs in the same competition if they're owned by the same people, because it could threaten the integrity of the competition. They could collude, they could sell players to each other, they could help each other out to get far in the competition. There is no danger of that happening with Palace and Lyon anymore. There wasn't in the first place, because we've never shared anything. We don't work as a multi-club ownership by definition. But what's the risk now? It says here, given all that, it might make sense for Palace to make a more general argument that strict application of the rules in this case simply makes no sense, which I would agree with that. There is also a line in UEFA's ruling that says that sporting integrity and justice should always win. And I would argue, after Palace's brilliant FA Cup campaign in one of the stories of the season, the fact that John Textor doesn't own Palace or Lyon anymore, and the fact he didn't control us anyway, means that the sporting justice is Palace are in the Europa League. That is why this has caused such a massive debate online, because the common sense, the reality, the thing that all football fans can see, doesn't line up with UEFA's rules, which makes UEFA's rules not fit for purpose. I am pretty confident these rules will change beyond this season, because what Palace have done is underlined how subjective they are, how flawed they are, and how multi-club ownership in UEFA's rulebook is not clearly defined, and clubs are easily able to find loopholes. It's also worth noting that allegedly Forest missed this deadline as well, but were given an extension. Why are they allowed an extension? Palace aren't allowed an extension. It's all very unclear. The whole thing, it just doesn't make sense. Well, some people might say, wouldn't you rather be in the Conference League as a Palace fan? You've got a better chance of winning it. That's true. That's true. If you could guarantee to me today that Palace would compete in the Conference League and win it, I would take that over being in the Europa League. Unfortunately, you can't guarantee that because it's European competition. Palace have never been in Europe before. There is no guarantee we would win it, even though we would be statistical favourites. It's also a means to an end. I want to be in the Europa League, not because I think we can win it. We couldn't win it, mate. If Spurs and Man United can get to the final, there's no reason why we can't go far. But I want to be in the Europa League to play the biggest teams in Europe. Palace have never been in Europe before. I don't watch Palace to win competitions. The FA Cup was amazing, don't get me wrong. But I'm not looking at the Europa League as a chance to win silverware next year. I'm looking at it as an amazing experience for us Palace fans. Also, it's the principle. I just don't believe that it is fair that we are demoted in this situation. I don't think Palace are the team to be making an example of in this particular instance. This is all ignoring the fact that Lyon got relegated from Ligue 1 because they didn't just break financial rules, they decimated financial rules. They were reinstated in a bit of a dodgy decision, which meant UEFA had to put them back into the Europa League. UEFA have just fined Lyon 50 million euros for breaking financial rules. That's fine. That gives you a feasible, tangible sporting advantage breaking financial rules. Crystal Palace, who have effectively failed to meet an administrative deadline, have been kicked out of the competition entirely when we would have our first ever European season. That, to me, as a principle, shows that big clubs are allowed smaller punishments and smaller clubs are made an example of. That is not fair. And look, let's say hypothetically, Palace were Forest in this situation and Forest were Palace. I would be saying the same thing. I am obviously a Palace fan, but I'm mainly a football fan. I don't think it's fair to kick Palace out entirely. Punish us, fine us, give us a points deduction in the Europa League. I don't care. But to kick us out entirely stinks. And I think most reasonable people can see that this is not a proportionate punishment. Do I think Palace's decision will be overturned? Honestly, at this point, I don't. Which is pretty sad. Do go and have a look at UEFA's rules. It's very interesting. It's very interesting and unclear, I think. I don't think that Crystal Palace meet the threshold of decisive influence. John Textor has publicly complained enough about it to make it pretty clear that he doesn't think he can do anything at Palace. Therefore, why would we be a threat to the integrity of the competition? You tell me. Anyway, let me know what you think in the comments down below. I appreciate this is confusing, it's complicated. Do ask any questions if you're not sure. I'll try and answer all the comments. Do subscribe. I'm now a full-time content creator, so weekly YouTube vids will be coming. Let me know what you want to see in the comments down below too. Come on, UEFA. I hope this is overturned. Come on, CAS, I should say, for the integrity of the competition. Everyone wants to see Palace in the Europa League. Definitely unbiased opinion.